Chapter 1. Wicked Game of Life. Barefooted, he was walking along the road, which had broken due to the blast. The hill station had lost its beauty it had a few hours ago. After burying his little angel, he returned to the hill station to find his mobile phone. It had become the most important thing for him due to the video he captured. He was hardly in his senses. His mind was full of complex and negative thoughts and hatred for everything. His foot collided with a rock, and he fell on the rocky ground of the hill. He could not walk more. The sun had set in the west, and his life had too. Daisy, Daisy. Where are my socks? He called his wife, but she was not there. There you go, Daddy. A cute little girl of nearly 9 years, wearing a magenta dress with a black hairband, came carrying his socks. Oh, thanks, dear. Where is your mommy, Jane? He asked his daughter while putting his socks on. She's in the washroom. Do you need anything else, Daddy? Jane asked innocently. Yes, of course, I do. I need a hug and kiss from you. Scott grasped her and kissed her cheeks. Jane hugged him and kissed him goodbye. As Scott left, she ran and reached the gate to see Scott taking out the car and leaving home. She used to watch him going daily. Scott Parker, the senior manager of a multinational company, was a very happy-go-lucky guy who had the most beautiful family. A loving and caring wife and a beautiful daughter. He used to consider himself to be the luckiest person. But life does not go the way we want it. It is not a bed of roses. It examines us and makes us stronger than we think we are. When we feel we cannot live without our loved ones, it snatches them and says, no. You can live without them. The same thing happened with Scott. The whole world had encountered a suspicious and deadly virus called COVID-19. This virus attacks on lungs and makes breathing harder for the infected person. It also affects the supply of blood in the body, and consequently, when the organs do not get enough blood, they lost the ability to function. Hundreds of people were dying daily in different countries. They had a strict lockdown in their country just like the other nations of the world, because this virus spreads more through the crowded areas where people gather, just like schools, markets, ceremonies, etc. Since the vaccines of COVID-19 were still not developed, only precautions were made essential to avoid getting caught by the coronavirus. Life had been besieged around their homes, and the army had taken control. The government had made masks a compulsory accessory, and the usage of sanitizer was ensured everywhere. It was a bright morning when Daisy was walking on the grass on their lawn. Scott entered the garden having a tissue in his hand with which he was wiping out his nose. Seeing him having flu, Daisy became anxious and said, Scott. What happened? Scott sat down on a swing hanging in the middle of their garden and said, Nothing, dear, I think I have strong flu. Daisy's mind was having thoughts she never wanted to think. She nearly ran towards the interior, brought a first aid box, and gave him pills to control his flu. Scott had got the idea of what she was thinking. To cheer her up, he said, Hey, do you think I have corona? Ha, come on, Daisy, the corona is not a fatal virus. They are just making the people frightened with such news. Scott used to think that corona was just an ordinary virus, and all deaths shown in the news are all due to some other causes, but Daisy was very anxious due to his flu. She gave him medications and sat with him. Deep inside, Scott feared that what if he had corona, Daisy and Jane might catch it too. Daisy. It would be best if you were with Jane. If I have corona, you both are vulnerable, and should stay away from me, and let me quarantine myself. I won't risk you both at any cost. Scott thought she would understand and would go from the room, but she was Daisy, the stubborn woman he had ever met. She angrily replied, Have you gone nuts, Scott? You think I will leave you in this condition? No. I will not. But I am going to talk to Jane about it. I'm sending her on the first floor. Daisy left the room and talked with her maid, who took Jane with her. Jane started crying when she came to know that her father might have corona. Daisy consoled her and said goodbye until her father recovers. Scott got better the next day, and they all thought that Scott did not have corona. Still, they kept their distance from Jane, but Daisy wasn't ready to leave Scott even for a second. No doubt she loved Scott more than anything, and so did Scott. But they both did not know what was in their fate. Their minor mistake changed everything in their lives. It has been 3 days since Scott had recovered from the flu, and Daisy felt mild headache and sore throat. She was taking regular medicines, but was not improving. Jane was playing her favorite game on her tablet in the lounge when she heard Daisy, who was continuously coughing in the kitchen. Jane quickly ran toward the kitchen and gave her a glass of water, but she could not control the cough. Jane dialed her father's number, who had gone to the supermarket to bring groceries. Scott reached home in no time and took Daisy to the hospital, where they tested her for corona and admitted her as she was corona positive. They isolated her, and only the nurses were allowed in the room. This was an agitated situation for Daisy, as she was having difficulty in breathing, and due to cough, she was feeling pain in her chest cavity. She was afraid and was crying, but Scott was also helpless as the hospital staff was not letting him meet her. Scott went home to see Jane as she was also worried and crying when Scott was taking her mother to the hospital. It was tough for him to tell Jane that her mother is corona positive. He entered the home in low despair. Jane rushed towards him, crying, "Daddy, how's the mother?" Scott was searching for the right words to say what she did not want to hear. He bent his knees, held her face in his hands, and said, "Your mother will be okay, and will be among us soon, I promise." "You promise? Daddy?" Jane wiped her tears with her wrist and replied, "Yeah, my darling, I promise you that." Scott replied without knowing that not every promise comes true. Daisy's condition was getting worse day by day. She was isolated in the hospital, but still did not seem to be recovering from this deadly virus. Scott was allowed to meet her only once in 24 hours. He used to sleep in the hospital, even the staff had told him to go home, but how could he leave her alone, knowing that he is responsible for her sickness? This thought was making him sleepless, and he regretted it. He wanted to go back in time and change the situation. But it was not possible. Scott had the virus in his body, and that was why he had flu, but his immune system was quite efficient in overcoming and fight against the virus. Consequently, he could quickly get over the virus, but Daisy did not have the potential to fight against the virus, and she offered the virus to attack herself by being with Scott while he was infected. Scott was regretting badly. This time when he went to meet her, he burst into tears and blamed himself. Daisy also started crying, but they both were helpless against this strange disease. Daisy knew that she did not have much time. She begged Scott to see Jane. Jane was asked to put on a safety sanitized suit before visiting her mother. Her little mind was unable to compile such sudden change in their happy life. She went inside the room where Daisy was isolated. Seeing her mother lying in a large empty room alone, she could not hold her tears and run towards Daisy. "Mommy, Mommy. What happened to you, Mommy?" Jane started crying and put her head enclosed in the protected helmet on her. "My love. I'm all okay." Daisy started coughing. "I have come to take you to the home, Mommy. Let us go." Jane held her hand and pulled gently toward her. "I can't go home right now, Jane." "But why?" Jane started to cry again. "Listen to me, Jane. Things can be different as we grow up. Life doesn't always go smoothly." Daisy sighed for a while with pain and continued. "Sometimes we have to lose the ones we love the most. You have to take care of your father. He is alone and broken. You have to fill up my space." "Your space? Where are you going, Mommy?" "I will not let you go anywhere. Please come back to home, Mommy." Jane was sobbing and blubbering with intense grief. Daisy hugged her and whispered, "I'm always with you, Jane." One of the staff members came into the room and asked Jane to go outside as the time was over. Jane was not ready to leave her mother and was crying out loud. The staff member had to hold Jane and dragged her outside the room, where other members of staff removed the protected dress from her and sanitized her again. Jane hugged Scott, crying and shouting. He took her to the hospital garden because the staff was unhappy with her as she was making noise, breaking the calm atmosphere of the hospital. Jane told him about what Daisy said. Scott also knew that this deadly virus would not let his beloved wife live. The world was helpless against this virus, and so did they. Jane slept in the lap of Scott while having hiccups. They both were left alone. That night was different from the previous nights. Jane was at her grandmother's home, and Scott was again trying to sleep on the hard flat bench outside the COVID-19 ward. It was 2 a.m., but still, he was awake. He got up and decided to have a tour around the hospital. He started walking through the corridors of the hospital. Very few staff members were walking here and there, and it was a calm and peaceful atmosphere around. Suddenly he heard someone crying with a low voice. Unintentionally his feet moved towards the room where the voice was coming from. It was an empty prayer room except for a man in the suit, sitting and sobbing. Scott sat down in front of him and put his hand on his shoulder. The guy raised his head and looked at Scott with teary red eyes. Scott can see his tiny blood vessels on his cornea. His fair complexion was diluted with redness due to continuous cries. "Do you have someone in serious condition?" Scott asked him to comfort him. "Yeah. My wife. She has corona, and she is in critical condition." The guy murmured hardly between hiccups. Scott thought he was watching himself in a mirror. He could not say anything. What could he say? How could he console him? He was himself within the same situation, same pain. Seeing Scott speechless, the guy asked about his sudden silence. "My wife is also suffering from corona." Scott could hardly speak. "Oh. We both are in the same sinking boat then." The guys took a pause and continued. "She is a doctor herself. And she just got infected from one of her patients." The guy wiped out his tears and nose with a tissue he took out from his bag. "So," the guy continued, "I'm Spencer Lincoln from Secret Intelligence Services." "Who are you?" It looked like he repeated his crammed words. Perhaps he used to say to the ones he used to capture as a suspect. "Scott Parker. I work as a senior manager at DG Corporation." Scott was feeling uncomfortable while introducing himself as it was not the situation to talk about who they are. But Spencer seemed to be a talkative guy who then tells Scott how his wife got infected with this fatal virus. "How did your wife get corona?" Spencer asked him, and this was the question Scott was trying to avoid. How could he tell him that his wife had gotten corona due to him? Before he utters anything, a nurse came into the room, said in a light tone, "Mr. Spencer Lincoln? Ma'am is having severe difficulty in breathing. We need to try some last-stage drugs for which we must take your signatures. You are supposed to follow me, sir." They both stood up. Scott tapped Spencer on the back and wished him the best of luck. Spencer wiped his sweat droplets running from his forehead and tapped back Scott. They both knew that the last-stage corona patients are not lucky to survive. Scott went to meet Daisy the next day. The nurse had told him that they had put a respiratory station and ventilation to help her with breathing. Scott got tears in his eyes seeing his wife lying between the machines. He was shocked when he saw her face. A blue tint had developed on her face and around her lips. But he did not want to make her afraid, so he did not tell her about her condition. "Daisy. I am here. Look at me, dear." Daisy opened her eyes. She wanted to hold his hand, but she had become so weak that she could not even raise her hand. Scott clasped her hand and kissed it. "I love you more than anything in this world, you know that, Daisy. The thought that you are here because of me does not let me sleep. I will never forgive myself." Scott was feeling intense grief. Tears ran out of Daisy's eyes and got dissolved in the pillow. She hardly opened her lips. It's none of your fault, Scott. It's my destiny. Things were had to go that way. Maybe we were made to be together for this much time only. But I'll always be with you. Just take care, Jane. I love you. Daisy could hardly utter some words, and she was out of breath. She was in pain and pressing her chest. Scott got scared and rushed towards the door to call some help, but nurses came into the room running before he goes out. They must have seen the condition of Daisy in the camera footage. They asked Scott to move outside. Scott went and banged his hand against the wall. He started to hate his life. The door opened, and the nurse informed him that Daisy was no more. Hearing this, he suddenly stopped crying. He had heard that if one cries on someone's death, the soul of the person suffers. He didn't know if it's true or not, but he didn't want to hurt her. How could he hurt her? He could not stand and sit down on the floor, because he had lost every drop of energy. Daisy was his energy. She was his strength, but now she was nowhere. The promise that Daisy made to Scott before their wedding had been fulfilled. Daisy had kept her promise. What if I die before you, Daisy? Staring at the horizon, Scott threw an unexpected question toward Daisy. I'll steal your death. I promise you that. Daisy replied while holding his hand. Scott climbed up on the deck of the ship and shouted by putting his hands around his mouth. Hey, Death Angel. You better stay away from me. My fiancé will steal my death, you hear me? Daisy was laughing. She raised her hand towards him, which he clasped and helped Daisy to reach on deck. It was their most beautiful journey before their wedding, where they made promises to one another, and one of those promises turned out to be true very soon. He came to his senses again when the sweeper came and asked him to stand up. Holding his tears inside the eyes, he dialed the number of Daisy's mother to tell them this saddest news. The hospital's authority refused to give a dead body, as she was a critical patient of the corona. He cleared some paperwork and was making necessary payments when he heard someone called his name. He turned back. It was Spencer. Hey, how's your wife, Scott? She's no more, Scott sighed. Oh. We both lost our half-lives. Spencer hugged Scott to console him and asked him to save his contact number. If you need me, I'll be there for you. Spencer said and smiled with sad eyes. Why are you still here? Scott asked him out of curiosity, because his wife had died the last night, and he must be at his home to attend visitors. I told you my wife was a doctor here. There was her stuff that I needed to pick from here. Spencer showed him a bag and smiled. His smile always used to make Scott gloomier. Scott shook hand with him and left the hospital with the heavy steps. Jane became silent when she heard this news. This pain was huge for a little girl. Scott's house was full of people who have come for condolence. Time heals things. We have to compromise in order to live. As time passes, Jane and Scott were recovering from this loss. The lockdown has been over, and life was coming back to normal with slight changes. Jane continued her school, and Scott was trying his best to focus on his job. Scott had never thought that he would have to live without Daisy. Life was so difficult without her. He was trying his best to make Jane happy, but she used to miss her mother very much. A giant picture of them in the lounge keeps reminding them how their life had been beautiful in the past. But Scott had got over the circumstances just for the sake of the only reason of his life, Jane. He had turned his whole life towards Jane, and had considered her as his only support and motivation to live. But who knew that life would play harshly with him? Who knew that his only hope to live was going to be snatched from him? Who knew that?